People of our great village, I stand before you to make a declaration. We must protect our land. This is our future.
Take this, it will keep you safe. I will wait for you.
Chief Udoka, the enemy approaches the borders.
Chioma, who is this?
I found him by the roadside, Mama.
Bring him in, close the door.
She didn't know who she saved until the whole village found out. On the night the river rose high enough to swallow the road whole, a woman named Amaka waded into water that had already taken 2 lives that week, not knowing that the stranger she pulled from beneath a fallen motorcycle would soon pull apart everything her family had spent 30 years trying to keep buried. She did not know his name. She did not know his face would one day appear on a palace wall. She only knew that a man was drowning, and that some decisions are made before the mind has time to argue with the heart. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The rain that night did not fall so much as it attacked, coming sideways off the hills in sheets that turned the road into a second river running alongside the first. Amaka had gone out only to check on her mother's goats, tied near the old bridge, when she heard the sound of metal scraping against stone and a voice that was barely a voice anymore, more breath than sound, calling for help into water that had no intention of answering back. She would say later that she did not think, she only moved, wading in past her waist, past her chest, until her hands found a man pinned beneath the weight of his own fallen bike, his strength already spent, his grip on consciousness slipping the way a rope slips through fingers too tired to hold on. His name, he told her once she had dragged him onto dry ground, was Keen. Nothing more. No family name. No explanation for the soaked leather bag he refused to let go of even as his own legs failed beneath him. No reason why a man traveling alone on a flooded back road would carry a document sealed in red wax the way kings seal their decrees. Amaka noticed the seal. She noticed the way his eyes moved to the darkness behind her whenever headlights passed on the distant highway. She noticed, most of all, the way he thanked her like a man and used to being helped by anyone who did not expect something in return. Her mother, a quiet woman named Chioma who had raised 2 children alone on the profits of a small food stall, took one look at the stranger's clothes and knew immediately that they had not been bought in any market she recognized. She said nothing that first night, only fed him, only watched him, only waited. It was Amaka's younger brother, Bashir, 16, and endlessly amused by his sister's habit of collecting strays and lost causes, who broke the tension by demanding that the stranger not touch his portion of meat, a joke that made even the exhausted Keen manage a tired laugh in the middle of a night that had nearly killed him. Even in that laugh, Amaka noticed something guarded, as though joy itself was a language he had not been given much permission to practice. Keen left before sunrise, disappearing into the dark the moment a convoy of headlights swept across the compound wall in the distance, a sight that frightened him more than the flood itself had. Before he vanished, he pressed something small into Amaka's palm, half of a carved wooden token, broken cleanly from a matching piece he did not explain. He told her to keep it, to show it only if someone ever came asking about that night, and to say nothing else. He promised he would return to answer every question she had not yet been allowed to ask. Amaka stood alone at the gate afterward, holding a stranger's secret in her hand, the rain still falling around her like it had not finished with either of them, and somewhere behind that closed fist, a feeling she could not yet name had already begun settling in. By morning, the market was already alive with talk of soldiers who had passed through Eek Road overnight, searching for a traveler whose absence had apparently caused a stir far beyond their small village. Amaka kept her face calm as she sold yams and peppers beside her brother, pretending the gossip meant nothing to her, even as her hand kept finding its way to the pocket where the token sat, warm from her own nervous grip. 2 women at the next stall argued over whether the missing traveler was a smuggler, a runaway husband, or something far more important than either, and Amaka found herself listening far more closely than she wanted to admit. measuring every rumor against the quiet stranger who had thanked her like a man and used to kindness. It did not take long for Elder Nwosu, the head of the village council, to approach her stall directly, flanked by two men whose presence alone was usually reserved for matters far more serious than lost travelers. He asked her plainly whether a stranger had stayed near her compound the previous night. She admitted only that she had helped a man nearly drowned in the flood, framing it as an act of basic decency rather than the beginning of anything larger. When he asked whether the man had given her anything, a token, a seal, a piece of paper, she lied without flinching, telling him she had received nothing but a simple thank you. Bashir later scolded her for lying to an elder, and Amaka corrected him gently, telling him that what she had done was protect a promise, and that a promise worth keeping was never quite the same thing as a lie. That evening, she finally showed her mother the token. What she expected was curiosity. What she received instead was silence, followed by a stillness in her mother's face that Amaka had never seen before, not even during the hardest years of raising two children alone. Chioma explained, slowly, that she had once held the matching half of that very symbol, 30 years earlier, long before Amaka was born, long before she ever settled in this village at all. She revealed that the man who had given it to her back then had been someone connected to a royal house, someone she had loved and lost under circumstances she had spent 3 decades trying not to remember. Circumstances she said she was not yet ready to speak aloud, even to her own daughter. Amaka pressed gently, asking why a token given away 30 years ago would resurface now, carried by a stranger pulled from a flood on the very road her mother had once walked as a young woman. Chioma admitted only that the royal house in question had never fully left her thoughts, even after 30 years of building a quiet life far from any palace, and that a symbol like that one did not simply travel by accident. She asked Amaka to be careful, warning her that some doors, once opened, could not easily be closed again, and that whatever Keen represented, he had not arrived in their lives by coincidence. Amaka listened, unsettled, aware for the first time that the night in the flood had not been an ending, but the opening line of a much longer story. Days passed with no word from Keen, and Amaka told herself she had not expected one, even as she found herself glancing toward the gate each evening when the light began to fade. Then, on the 5th morning, a royal envoy arrived at their compound, dressed in cloth too fine for their dusty road, requesting that Amaka and her mother present themselves at the palace by nightfall. Bashir watched the envoy's carriage disappear down the road with wide eyes, asking his sister what exactly she had pulled out of that river. Amaka did not answer him. She was already staring at the token in her hand, wondering for the first time whether keeping a promise to a stranger might cost her far more than she had ever agreed to pay. Inside the grand hall of the palace, seated beside his father, was Keen, no longer soaked and desperate, but dressed now in the unmistakable cloth of a prince, the very title he had hidden from her that first night beside the river. Chief Udoka thanked Amaka publicly for saving his son's life and asking nothing in return, a gesture she accepted with far more composure than she felt, informing him quietly that she had asked for a name and had only ever received half of one. The chief studied her for a long moment, as though searching her face for something familiar he could not quite place, a resemblance he could not yet explain even to himself. It was in that same hall that Lady Obiagili entered, elegant and watchful, introducing herself as the woman the council had already arranged for Keen to marry long before his accident on the flooded road. The announcement landed on Amaka like a second flood, quieter than the first but somehow more disorienting, because this time there was no current to blame and no water to fight, only the plain fact of an arrangement she had not been told existed. Keen tried to explain that the engagement was a matter of political peace between two royal houses rather than personal affection, but Amaka reminded him coldly that kingdoms do not drown, and hearts should not be asked to dry themselves out on command. She walked out of that hall determined not to look back, though Keen followed her into the courtyard, insisting that everything he had said to her beside the river had been true, even if what it could become had never truly been his to offer. He told her that his entire life had been built around duty before desire, and that the night she pulled him from the water was the first time in years he had felt like a man rather than a title waiting to be inherited. Amaka, though softened slightly by his honesty, still asked him plainly what she was meant to do with a truth that arrived far too late to change anything that mattered, a question he had no answer for. Word of Amaka's visit to the palace spread through the village faster than the flood itself had risen, and by the following afternoon, a council advisor named Obins, a man long jealous of Elder Nwosu's influence, saw an opportunity to make himself useful to the chief by digging into the stranger's past who had captured a prince's gratitude. He began quietly asking questions in neighboring villages about a woman named Chioma who had once lived closer to the palace decades earlier, a woman whose name, he discovered, had once been spoken alongside Chief Udoka's before she disappeared from royal circles entirely. Obins kept his findings to himself for now, calculating exactly how such information might be used to strengthen his own standing with the council when the moment was right. Back at the palace, it was Chioma who interrupted what might have become a quiet unraveling between Amaka and Keen in the courtyard, stepping forward with her half of the token raised toward Chief Udoka, asking him directly whether 30 years of silence could really stand in front of her and still pretend not to recognize her face. Udoka's expression broke the moment he saw both halves of the symbol reunited in the hands of two women he had once assumed were lost to him entirely, one by circumstance, one by time. Servants nearby paused their duties, sensing that whatever conversation was about to unfold was not meant for their ears, though none of them dared to leave the hall entirely. Udoka led Chioma into a private chamber, where he finally admitted that he had searched for her for nearly 2 years after she vanished, only to be told repeatedly by his own council that she had chosen to leave on her own and did not wish to be found. Chioma corrected him firmly, explaining that she had not abandoned him at all, but had instead been quietly removed from his life by advisors who considered her an inconvenient truth rather than an acceptable future for a man who would one day rule. She told him that she had carried their unborn child alone from that day forward, raising her in a village far enough from the palace that no one would ever think to look for a hidden royal bloodline. The realization that followed struck Amaka harder than anything the flood had thrown at her. If her mother and Chief Udoka had once loved each other deeply enough to exchange a token meant for reunion, and if Keen was Udoka's son from an earlier marriage, then the fear that had quietly built inside her, the fear that she and Keen might have been drawn toward each other by more than simple chance, gave way instead to something far gentler than either of them expected. Chioma clarified immediately that Amaka was, in fact, Udoka's daughter through the very promise he had once been forbidden to keep, which meant that the man Amaka had pulled from the river was not a stranger who might become something more, but a brother she never knew existed. Keen absorbed the revelation slowly, admitting afterward that what he felt was not loss, but a strange, unexpected relief, as though a debt he did not know how to repay had transformed instead into something simpler and far more permanent. Amaka, for her part, allowed herself a small laugh amid the shock of it all, telling him that she had gained a brother in a flood and very nearly lost her own dignity, chasing a fairy tale that had never truly belonged to her in the first place. Chief Udoka turned to Chioma with an apology 30 years overdue, asking how he might even begin to make amends for the silence his own council had forced between them, though he already suspected no words would be enough. Before the household could settle into this new understanding, Obins arrived at the palace gates requesting an urgent audience, claiming he had information the chief needed to hear before the sun set. He revealed what he had learned about Chioma's history, framing it not as a family reunited, but as a scandal the palace could ill afford, warning that if the story reached Lady Obiagili's family in its rawest form, the alliance meant to secure peace between two regions could collapse entirely. Chief Udoka listened in silence, his jaw tightening, aware that the very truth he had just begun to embrace as a gift was already being reshaped by others into a weapon aimed squarely at his family's future. Word of the hidden daughter reached Lady Obiagili's family before the sun had fully set, carried there deliberately by Obins, who calculated that chaos within the royal household would only strengthen his own position once the dust settled. With it came a threat to withdraw the alliance entirely unless the matter was resolved by morning, a threat delivered by messengers who made clear that their patrons considered themselves insulted by a scandal they had learned of secondhand rather than from the chief himself. Chief Udoka, standing before his own council, declared that he would rather lose an alliance built on convenience than spend another single night choosing his kingdom's comfort over his own family's truth, a declaration that silenced even his most skeptical advisors. It was Lady Obiagili herself who ended the tension in the room, admitting to everyone present that she had never wanted to marry a man who was already in love with someone else long before he had ever met her, and asking simply to be released from an arrangement that had never been real for either of them. She revealed, quietly, that she had agreed to the engagement only because her own family had pressured her into believing it was the only path toward securing her younger siblings' futures, and that she had spent months quietly, hoping some circumstance might free her from a promise she never truly wanted to keep. Keen thanked her honestly, telling her she deserved a marriage chosen freely, not one assembled out of obligation on either side. Obins, sensing that his attempt to weaponize the scandal had instead strengthened the very family he hoped to weaken, tried one final approach, suggesting to the wider council that a chief who could not control his own household truths was unfit to guide the kingdom through uncertain times. Elder Nwosu, the very man who had once interrogated Amaka over a stolen glance at a wooden token, surprised the gathered crowd by standing against Obins publicly, agreeing openly that a council too afraid to bend for love had never truly been protecting peace, only protecting its own pride, and that hunting for scandal was a poor substitute for genuine governance. His words shifted the room's mood entirely, leaving Obins isolated among advisors who had quietly grown tired of his maneuvering. The following morning, the entire village gathered inside the council hall to hear Chief Udoka speak plainly about a truth he had hidden for 30 years, admitting before his own people that fear of scandal had once cost him a daughter he never got the chance to raise. He spoke of Chioma not as an inconvenient secret, but as a woman he had loved honestly, and of Amaka not as a complication, but as proof that some truths survive even decades of enforced silence. Murmurs moved through the crowd, some skeptical, some moved, but none indifferent, and by the time he finished speaking, even those who had arrived doubtful found themselves nodding along with his account. Amaka addressed the crowd herself, telling them that she had walked into a flood expecting to save a stranger, and had instead walked out with a brother she never knew she had, a father whose existence had been hidden from her entire life, and a mother whose 30 years of silence finally made sense. She spoke of the token that had traveled between 2 generations, carrying with it a promise that had waited patiently through 30 years of separation to finally be honored, and she told the gathered villagers that she did not regret a single step she had taken into that dangerous water on the night everything began. By the time the ceremony ended, the village that had once whispered about a mysterious traveler on Eek Road was already retelling the story differently, this time as one of a woman whose small act of courage during a single storm reunited a family that had been quietly broken apart for 3 decades. Keen stood before Amaka publicly, calling her his sister for the first time in front of the entire council, promising a lifetime of gratitude he knew he could never fully repay for a debt that began the moment she pulled him from beneath the wreckage of his own fallen bike. Amaka, smiling despite everything the past days had put her through, told him simply that he could start by finally sharing his food with Bashir, a joke that reminded everyone present that even a story built on royal secrets and 30 years of hidden truth still had room left for laughter. Chief Udoka formally welcomed Amaka into the royal household that same afternoon, announcing before the council that she would be recognized publicly as his daughter, with all the respect and protection that recognition demanded. He turned to Obins, who stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, and informed him plainly that a council built on loyalty had no place for advisors who mistook cruelty for strategy, a statement that ended, without further ceremony, whatever influence Obins had once hoped to gain from the scandal he tried to create. Bashir, watching from the crowd, whispered to no one in particular that his sister had somehow turned a flood into a whole kingdom, a comment that made even the more serious members of the council smile. That evening, mother and daughter returned quietly to the same riverbank where everything had first begun, sitting together in the fading light as the water moved gently past them, no longer the violent force that had once threatened to take a stranger's life. Chioma asked her daughter whether she regretted stepping into that flood on a night when common sense would have told anyone else to stay far away. Amaka answered that she did not, telling her mother that the river had not taken anything from either of them that night. It had simply returned something they had both lost without ever realizing it was missing. In the village of Omooji, people still say that a river never truly loses what falls into it. It only carries that truth home by a longer road, and that some secrets, like some people, are simply waiting for the right storm to finally bring them back into the light. Amaka often returned to that same riverbank in the years that followed, not out of sorrow, but out of a quiet gratitude for the night of flood tried to take a stranger's life, and instead handed her a family she never knew she was missing. Proof that courage shown to someone unknown can quietly rewrite the story of everyone involved.